Thank you. It'll be fun.
Okay, so we have another few seconds.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Kauffman, the founder of the Institute of Coaching with Margaret Moore and Susan David. I also happen to be a senior leadership advisor at Egon Zehnder, which is a leadership advisory, management consulting firm, etc. And I am here with Dick Patton, who, by the way, is my neighbor, but he also just happens to be the head of the CEO practice at Egon Zehnder. So recently, Dick has spearheaded this incredible resource for us, which you can find links to, which is a CEO survey where nearly 1,000 CEOs responded to a number of questions, to 12 of them. And you can see the more extended report on the Egon Zehnder website, and we'll have links to it. To start out, Dick, why don't you share a bit about not only this CEO survey, but how it builds on one from 3 years ago?
Great. Well, thank you, Carol. I should also mention that I co-lead the practice with Kati Najaporshuti. So if she ever sees this, I want to give her a shout out.
Hi, Kati.
Yeah, but yeah. So the composition of this report is probably good to ground us in terms of who responded. There were 1,000 respondents in 19 countries, and among those respondents, I'll give you a little bit of demographic distribution. Most of them were Americans. I think the number was close to 20% were Americans, and then a bunch of other countries around the world, including Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Western and Eastern Europe. And companies of all types of ownership structures, private equity, family-owned, publicly traded, companies of various sizes. We have a whole slew of companies that are over $20 billion in market cap, and then ones who are under $1 billion in market cap as well. Of the respondents, about a quarter are also chairs of their company boards, and that's an interesting one that we may get to later in the conversation, because for Americans who are listening, about 50% of the S&P 500 CEOs are also their board chairs, but in other parts of the world, that number is much smaller.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing that was really an amazing figure to me is this really is a pretty representative sample in many cases. But do you want to talk about the annual revenue that is represented by this group?
Yes, it's almost 4 trillion. So I think the exact number is 3.7 trillion. So there are a lot of big companies in this pool, and there are also some small ones. We didn't want to bias everything towards huge publicly traded companies, because we wanted to understand if CEOs are dealing with similar variables in their roles, whether or not they're family owned or, let's say, a $600 million company. We wanted to understand the differences and similarities between those CEO journeys and the ones among the companies who are among the biggest in the world.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say is, for you, the number one most interesting and useful finding?
I think the for this group in particular, the group meaning who is viewing this, I think some of the struggles, especially with respect to self-awareness, that CEOs and human beings have been facing since the beginning of time, I think many of them are relatively unchanged. But one of the coolest findings from this survey is the willingness to talk about them. The sort of diagnostic tools that CEOs and all of us, frankly, have today to examine our own motivations, our own identities, and how they come across in what CEOs were willing to share with us. Remember, this is a survey of a ton of people. The degree of honesty and of vulnerability you see in the responses, particularly the free text responses, really bowled us over.
Can you share a couple of those with us? What were
Yeah,
some things people said?
sure. This notion of am I enough? Am I enough
Mhm.
for this role and what it demands of me? Um, the idea that one of the quotes from the free text responses is, um, when you become the CEO, you lose yourself in the role.
Mhm.
That's another sort of area of detachment. I'm going to just cheat here and look. Another one is, I'm really beginning to question whether the CEO job is still worth it.
Wow.
These are now, some of these tend to be the most dramatic and interesting ones tend to be, um, I don't know if negative is the right word, but tend to be self-doubting in some ways.
Mhm.
There were other more sort of confident ones, but those are the ones that really stuck out to us in terms of willingness to share how they're feeling in the role and some of the questions they have about the role in themselves and serving in the role.
Yes, it is a kind of humility, actually. So I was thinking about this. So one day I happened to be coaching a couple of CEOs of Fortune 20 and then another one like FTSE 50. And both of them were talking about, can I really do this? And this is in the context of these people are brilliant. But the one thing that really struck me for both of them, they both talked about how they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, just worrying about their companies. And then just sort of, I think what we see is that the kind of pressure on these people would just crush an ordinary person.
Hmm.
And so I think that it is important that when people go in, they have expectations of what CEOs are like,
Hmm.
and them feeling like they have splinters in their brains isn't what you expect. So I think it's really helpful for coaches to hear that message that you're saying.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and I obviously I don't know who those individuals are,
yeah.
but one question, and you and I have talked about this, is, are they worried about their companies or are they worried about themselves?
Mm,
And if so, if it's the latter, like what exactly are they worried about? And there's a of course you have to approach these subjects with care, and sometimes they take a lot of time, but but more and more we're hearing CEOs share that it's the latter, not the former.
mhm. So tell us some more about the questions. One of the things I thought that was really compelling and good for our coaches and leaders to know is about this dual journey. Could
Mhm.
you describe the dual journey and then describe how that was different in the 2021 survey from the 2018 survey?
Yeah. So the number of CEOs who shared with us that they agree or strongly agree with the notion that I have to transform myself and my company, it was 97% in this survey in 2021. The number within that 97% who said that they strongly agree with that was 80%. So most of them said they strongly agree. When you
Mm,
compare that number to 2018, it was 25 or 26%. So net, I know that's a bunch of numbers there. Essentially, the agreement with the statement that I have to transform myself and my company tripled between 2018 and 2021. That's only 3 years. It was about 3.5 years if you really get down to the months. That's a first of all, it's a staggering admission, and second of all, the growth in that admission really impressed us. Um, you asked about to explain what we mean by the dual journey. It's this transformation of self in addition to transformation of one's company. The some of the work we do, the developmental work we do with aspiring CEOs or even CEOs once in the role is how are you stretching yourself so that you can know what it feels like to be stretched as you're transforming your company. This sort of not only not only raises the level of empathy for the CEO, and we'll talk about how that, when it comes to engaging your teams and your employees, how that's important, but it's just it's good for you to have that same kind of workout that you're asking your employees and the rest of the company to go through so that you can relate to them better, stretch yourself, see what the possibilities are, sort of open up the solution set, which is a big requirement for CEOs operating in the environment today. And as we talk to CEOs, we sort of go along that we hear them go along this, I guess I'll call it a performance journey. You know, a few years ago, CEOs thought that you had to perform in order to get the license to transform. It's a very linear way of thinking, excuse me, thinking about it. So what I really want to do is notch a couple of great quarters, or maybe a string of 3 or 4 or 5 great quarters, so that, you know, investors and maybe my board will give me the lateral license I'm really looking forward to in order to transform my company. That has changed, and the relationship between performance and transformation has become much more interlocked, so that today transforming is considered performing. In other words, if you're not transforming, you're not performing. And that's a different speed. It requires a different capacity, and it requires constant self-work as you're working on the company and its transformation.
So when you think of the qualitative responses that you got, is there some color that you could add to that you remember? I mean, I know you have 5,000 pages of qualitative response, so you may not be able to cherry pick, but what comes to mind to give you the sense, either from your own experience or from the qualitative responses, particularly about how are they stretching themselves? How are they managing this dual pressure?
Mm-hmm. I think one way that CEOs are managing it is seeking more feedback, is getting an understanding of self through the eyes of others. When we asked CEOs who they turn to for, quote, truly honest feedback, what I think the two most interesting parts of that are who they literally said they turned to, and it was their executive leadership team was first. Second was their chair, and third was a personal relationship. You go down the list, there are many more options. So who they turn to is interesting, but what I think was even more noticeable or more memorable for me is that we asked this same question in 2018 when we did a similar survey, and literally every single category went up. I'm reminded, you and I are both in the Boston area. I'm reminded of a CEO dinner we hosted a couple years ago, back when hosting dinners was a thing. And there were 25 CEOs from the Boston area in attendance. And we started talking about feedback and executive coaching. And one of the CEOs asked the other CEOs to raise their hands about who has an executive coach. And 24 of the 25 CEOs raised their hand. And seeking feedback from an outside consultant, 1/3 of the CEOs in our survey clicked yes, that's one of the places where they ask for feedback. I think it's just remarkable to me the thirst for feedback has increased across the board. Some people are more comfortable, have different relationships with various options than others, but I almost don't care where they're seeking it from. Just the fact that they're seeking more and more of it is a really positive sign to me.
Absolutely. It seems like it tracks also to people being less comfortable being autocratic, and that there's a lot more collaboration. And in order to collaborate, you have to know what other people are thinking of you. And that's amazing, because it's also less of a power move to be asking, say, how am I doing? Do you have suggestions for me? That really is such a change in terms of how CEOs are operating.
It is, but as they say, it's complicated. When you were saying that, I was thinking, yes, there's this significant increase in feedback seeking, but it hasn't necessarily resulted in like tremendous alignment across the board. And what I mean by that is when you look at the data from our survey, 46% of CEO respondents said that they feel fully aligned with their executive teams. 40% said they feel fully aligned with their boards. Those are both low. When you think about what we've heard from CEOs and from C-suite executives all over the world throughout the pandemic, is that and boards as well, the frequency of communication has gone way up. Now that people aren't traveling as much, and once we adjusted to video conferencing all the time, me being a CEO, my access to my teams just really ramped up. We didn't ask the same question in 2018, so I can't tell you about a change versus that time period. But it's pretty surprising that less than half of CEOs feel fully aligned with their boards and fully aligned with their executive leadership teams. Mm-hmm. So this feedback seeking, while it has increased their self-awareness, which is great, a real sort of a real blocker for the biggest development area we saw from the survey for CEOs is in what we call the relational capacity. Mm-hmm. And specifically, almost half of them cited that they're too impatient and don't listen, two qualities that they consistently hear from that feedback. And so they're hearing the feedback, but they're not necessarily putting it into action. So while I'm encouraged by the hunger for information, the hunger for feedback and for self-improvement and self-understanding, I think there's a ways to go when it comes to putting that feedback into action.
What's great about that, Dick, is it really shows an evidence base for when our leadership coaches are approaching a company organization to be able to say, so, like, what a place to be able to come in and see value, to know, okay, so 60% of CEOs, may be feeling in alignment, but 40% are not. Where are you? And also to come in not with the expectation or to even share the feedback, the survey directly with the CEO to say, so, with 1,000 CEOs we talked to, 46% felt fully in alignment with their teams. What about you? It sort of gives people permission. And it also gives us as coaches sort of a way into the conversation for individual coaching, team coaching, and also helping them work with their boards. Mm-hmm. So I'd love a thought about that, but then I want to go back to your 3 top behaviors they need to change.
Sure. My thought on that is, I hope that the people who are watching this use this data in exactly the way that you've just described, Carol. I know that you just got back from presenting to many CEOs in the Mediterranean area, and one of the things that when you really dug into the survey results was the fact that we addressed CEOs as you. In other words, we heard this from CEOs. So I think the way you just kind of juxtaposed the question with the data is the perfect way to use it. This is what 1,000 CEOs from all over the world have said. How do you feel about it? This isn't sort of some other mythical, since you were in Athens, Olympic sort of mountain of gods. This is real people answering real questions, and it's real data that you can use as a way into having, deeper conversations with CEOs and C-suite executives that you're coaching.
So the other thing is, when we did our little 2-minute promo last week, we talked about one of my favorite topics, which is the Achilles heel question. So when I heard you all ask the Achilles heel question, I was delighted. Do you want to share that one and also what you found?
So I think you're referring to the one where we ask CEOs about what their Achilles heel is, and there was some options, but there was a ton of free text responses about this as well. And 45%, I think I alluded to this a little bit before, 45% said that impatience and not listening were their biggest Achilles heel.
Mhm.
And it's interesting. We got that back, and it took us a little while to process it. Partly because the data came screaming at us, but also not in a linear way. A lot of it was free text because we gave them the option to fill out, like, to answer the question in their own words. So we had to kind of mash all of this together, and it was it was um, it was really rich data. But then as we kind of processed it and thought about CEOs who we know and who we've worked with and so forth, we started to think like, there's almost a little bit of machismo in being impatient and not listening, and sort of driving so hard for results that any obstacle in my way, I'll knock down so that I can achieve the goal. And um, we didn't want to let CEOs off the hook by relishing this sort of what this could mean to them. And we were very direct in our writing about it, that it's not cool to be impatient. It's not okay not to listen. You will both turn off the pipeline of orientation and self-awareness, as well as your ability to engage and lead others, if you sort of bask in this not listening and this impatience.
Mhm.
It may seem like it's not really a backhanded compliment, but it may seem okay, but it isn't okay. It will affect in a negative way, it'll affect your ability to lead.
Mhm. What's wonderful about that is, for those of us listening, is it helps give us kind of a sense of authority when we say that. Because we can sort of say it from, wow, the 20 whole CEOs I've coached, this year, or versus 1,000 people talked about their Achilles heel. And what will kill you is if you talk too much, you do not listen, and you are impatient.
Mhm.
Now, at the same time, someone here mentioned about how often the CEO role is changing. So what's really hard is how do you do that when, again, you're living in the kind of situation that would crush an ordinary person,
Mhm.
and that, what did you say in that a different proprietary study you did, where 50% of CEOs, 50% of companies had 3 or more CEOs, and I think 40 something percent were dramatic departures. And so we're also talking about not being impatient under incredible duress.
Mhm.
So I think it's sort of easy to say, hey guys, like, straighten up, but also to have empathy for them in terms of what they're going through every day, as well as you said earlier, everybody owns them.
Mhm.
So just some thoughts on from where you sit, what can help these CEOs become more resilient so they can be more patient? What's your hit on that?
So a couple things. One is, I just want to go back 1 minute, and I'm glad you mentioned talking too much. I forgot to mention that in the Achilles heel responses we got. It's
Yeah.
not just not listening and being impatient. Talking too much was another prominent part of that. Roughly 50% of CEOs who cited this. But to go back to answering your question, you're right. The average tenure between 2011 and 2011 and 2020 for a CEO among the 214 companies all over the world who we studied was 3.6 years, and that number is decreasing every year.
Mm,
Every year within those 10 years, we've seen a record number of turnovers. So the tenure is going down, and 39% of transitions were what we're calling emergency transitions. In other words, it wasn't expected by the board. Either the CEO didn't sign the contract, they were fired, or they left suddenly.
yeah.
That's it's pretty hard to be a CEO, and it's pretty hard to be a board these days with that level of turnover.
Mhm.
Um, but to get to your question about, like, man, if there's so much going on, 90% of CEOs in our survey agreed with the statement I'm moving toward the center of a more diverse, a louder, more diverse and diverging set of voices. The job is becoming harder, the tenure is becoming shorter, the expectations are shifting with respect to stakeholder primacy. And by that I mean a wide group of stakeholders expecting a wide number of things from CEOs. Like how the heck can they succeed both personally and professionally in that environment? And what we've discovered, and this is partly from the survey, but also we've done something like 2,000 CEO transitions over the last 5 years. And as you know, because you've worked with us for a long time, and you're also part of us now. We all talk. It's a big firm, but we sort of feel like a boutique. At least we do to ourselves inside, and we learn from each other. And what we've discovered is that there are 3 key capacities that enable CEOs to perform better in this environment, which are adaptive, self-awareness, and relational. These are not in lieu of being a great strategist or being a really determined and curious a person and leader, or to be able to make decisions without all the information. These capacities, and they're called capacities on purpose. They're not competencies or skills. These are aimed at sort of increasing, expanding one's leadership ability to lead through what the environment is today, both within a company and within within a community and within the business sector that you operate in. And those 3, a key thing about them is that they're interrelated. They're not sort of 3 separate things. They're quite dependent on one another. And more specifically, adaptive is fairly straightforward. It's fairly easy to understand. It's about what you need to start, stop, and continue doing. It's especially relevant during the pandemic when everything shifted, and I don't know what everything is going to shift to, or even if it will, but certainly the environment changed from one thing to another, and will probably change, maybe not as abruptly, but probably change to something else. So adaptiveness is quite dependent on self-awareness and on being relational. And relational, as we've cited earlier, is the one that CEOs struggle with the most. And I think one of the most interesting parts of relational is the give and take part of relational. I think it's pretty well known that CEOs are more effective when they're more empathetic, when they're more authentic, empathetic, and vulnerable. But one thing I've seen a lot of CEOs not struggle with, but have to learn, is the other side of that. They give a lot, and they sometimes don't understand how to take in exchange for that giving. So in exchange for that giving, to take accountability and a commitment to performance to the people they're giving to. And then self-awareness is about sort of exploring yourself, seeking the feedback that we were talking about earlier. And those 3 capacities all sort of work with each other, and particularly work towards making you more adaptive.
Mm-hmm. So as we near the end, I'd love to just share one thing that one of our fellows did, a woman named Monique Velcourt, who was a business professor and now is a leadership coach. And so how do we take all the things that Dick has shared with us and translate them into an intervention? So I want to share what she said on impatience and not listening. I felt I was getting nowhere during a recent executive coaching session. I finally said to the client, "May I share with you what I'm experiencing as I'm listening to you? I feel like I'm treading water while I wait and hope that we'll be able to reestablish connection and have a 2-way conversation." She had no idea she was having that impact. So I think the combination of hearing all of this, and for us as leadership coaches, finding our way to comment on that through sort of naming it, naming your experience of it, and also being able to couch it in the larger frame of, and 80% of the CEOs are having this issue. 50% of 1,000 CEOs name this, takes the shame away. So it takes the sting out of it. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about your survey is it can help CEOs feel less alone and less a sense of shame about the areas where they need to grow. So thank you, Dick, so much
Thank
for
you.
being with us.
Thank you very much.